It was somewhat different in Rhodesia than in the others because the white Rhodesians had relatively good relations with the Africans inside Rhodesia, whereas in
Yes.
Kenya and Uganda, it was a bit more hostile because of just
Yeah.
different circumstances. So then Britain at the end of World War II, because it had decided to continue participating in the war and to do so in the way it did, was broke. I mean, during like 1940, they were melting wedding rings to send America as gold payment for arms and such.
Yes.
So it lacked the resources to continue developing and holding on to the empire largely, and it also lacked the will to do so. In part, that was socialism and wanting to fund the NHS rather than build railroads in Kenya. But it was also that they saw imperialism as a net bad or net evil rather than
Yes.
net good. So they wanted to give up their colonies. That, though, was much more like a 50s type of thing and 60s type of thing because during World War II, Rhodesia, in exchange for its service in the war, had been promised that it could declare independence if it wanted to, and that it could do so on its own terms rather than being told what to do by the British government. It chose
Right.
not to because it thought that being part of the Commonwealth would be a good decision, just economically for it. That came back to bite it because once decolonization really got going in the 50s and 60s, the British state no longer wanted to continue supporting its property rule system. They saw that as being evil in comparison to mass democracy, which mass democracy would have empowered the Africans as opposed to just the property holders, both white and African. And so it became a problem. And the decolonization really got going in like the early 60s, and particularly the Belgian Congo. The Belgians just decided to be done with it and up and left one day. And
Yeah.
that devolved into chaos, particularly the Simba Rebellion, which I believe was in 1965. And because of that, the Belgians who survived fled from the Congo, and a good number of them fled from the Congo into Rhodesia, which the Rhodesians saw that and decided they didn't want to go down the same path as the
Yes.
Congo.
Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to the Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Support the forum. Go to buymeacoffee.com/fountainheadforum. Thank you. Welcome to the Party Pal. This is Fountainhead Forum 215. I'm talking with Will Tanner, who is with the American Tribune News. And we're going to talk about a topic that has fascinated me for a while, and that is the topic of the country of Rhodesia and what happened there. And, obviously this leads to Zimbabwe, which perhaps became the worst example of a corrupt African dictatorship. And we ask ourselves, how did this happen? And Will hopefully will have some insights on this. How are you, Will?
I'm doing well. What about you?
I'm doing fine. Yeah. So, how did you get into how did you get into this topic of Rhodesia and get into topics like this? Because
A very convoluted way.
Yeah.
So when I was like 10, I thought that Eric Prince, who ran Blackwater, was the coolest guy ever. I still think he's
Yes.
awesome, but back then I was like really into like Blackwater and all that. And through that, I found Soldier Fortune magazine, which was
Yeah.
started by a guy named Robert Brown. And he wrote a book that happened to come out around the time I was interested in that, called Dancing with Devils. And in it, he describes smuggling guns through his like local airport to the Rhodesians because of the embargo. It's hard to get stuff there.
Yes.
And while over there, he'd fight alongside the Rhodesians against the communists, just going out on patrols for fun. And I thought that was interesting and kind of wondered why he'd be so interested in fighting for Rhodesia. So then I started reading more about it after that, and have kind of gradually read and learned more.
Yeah. So, and I always like to say, when in doubt, zoom out. Let's go back and start at the beginning. When was obviously Rhodesia, that's named for Cecil Rhodes.
Mm-hmm.
What can you tell us about how this started out? I mean, who was Cecil Rhodes, and what did Cecil Rhodes do in the southern part of Africa?
Yeah, that's actually one of the more interesting parts of its story. Is so Rhodes saw that there's this large area of Africa that was uncolonized, and he wanted to secure it for the crown, but he thought the crown might not go for it because of the added expense. So he decided to put together a private expedition that would conquer it and make it British territory in fact rather than by law. And so he put together what was called the Pioneer Column. And Cecil Rhodes, for those who don't know, was one of the big proponents of the British Empire and a very wealthy man who contributed heavily towards building it up. So he put together the Pioneer Column, which instead of wanting for it to be a rogues gallery of ruffians and the sort, he was looking for the best. And so they screened a lot of people and screened out a lot of people. And it ended up being, to some extent, the British gentry and nobility who were looking for something fun to do, particularly the second sons and third sons who had little else to do back at home. So then they marched north from South Africa into what is now Zimbabwe and Zambia, and back then ended up being called Rhodesia, and conquered it. There weren't many people there, so there wasn't much to conquer other than just empty space, hippas, and all the megafauna of Africa.
All this stuff that really wants to kill you.
Exactly.
What kind of crazy men do this? It's like
exactly. So they did that and put it together, but that was the British South Africa company that funded the venture and that wanted to retain it. So it became associated with the British Empire, but was really company land, much like Jamestown originally was, or the British Raj was ruled by the East India Company.
Yeah, or also was that also something like maybe the Congo too, which is, of course isn't too far away, because that was actually King Leopold's property, and that's an awful story, but we won't get into that. But yeah.
So they ruled that, and it was ruled by the company until the 1920s, and then I believe in 21 it became self-ruled, and they called it responsible government, I believe. And so the locals, as opposed to the company, had their own legislature and their own governor, and as part of the Commonwealth Empire, ruled themselves and contributed to the empire's defense and economy.
Yeah. I think this might have also been how some of the original American colonies were formed too. They were often a company, but they were fur trading companies or something like that. You had to have some kind of economic incentive because you've got to offer great rewards, because not everybody wants to do this, but you've got to be. You have people who are usually kind of courageous, maybe a little bit crazy, and in some cases also have a lot of money so they can go finance these trips and say, okay, I'll go into this land that hasn't been touched by anybody, and we'll see what we can do. So that's what happened. So it was a company. I believe it was probably diamond mining, or what were they doing there?
There are natural resources and metals in Zimbabwe. It was much more that Rhodes both wanted to seize it for the crown and wanted to be able to have a railway going from all the way from Cairo into South Africa, the African Railway. So he needed the land. And so it was mainly farmed was their main industry rather than mining, though there was some mining to the north. So it was much more like Jamestown than like a Spanish colony in terms of being company owned and agricultural.
I didn't realize Rhodes was into the railroad business, but obviously that was something that, all these lands that got colonized by Britain, they ended up with, I think Britain was about the only one that maybe built them railroads. I don't know if anybody else did build them railroads, but, India has all of its railroads from the British too. And the railroads are still there, but yeah. So did they succeed in building a Cairo, South Africa railway? That's certainly
not quite, because of the middle. There's famously Victoria Falls, as in Zambia and Rhodesia, and it was hard to overcome. There was also trouble in the middle of Africa, so they almost did it, but there were a few gaps. Particularly towards the middle.
Yeah. Okay. So, but you had they have a railroad probably that went from Rhodesia all the way to the coast, so they could take stuff down to the south and then ship it out on boats that way. So,
right, and also through Portuguese Mozambique, which was to the east.
Yeah, Mozambique being on the east side, and Namibia. Angola was also Portuguese, and then there was Namibia, which was a German colony for a while, and then the British took it over after World War I.
Right.
It was also called Southwest Africa. Yeah. So, and Botswana's in there too. Yeah. So this was so they had a company there, and they were just bringing up resources. What were some of the resources?
The company wasn't overly involved, from what I can tell, in resource extraction. It was really mainly agriculture, and they just wanted to have the territory. The resources currently there, I believe there's like cobalt and nickel, maybe. I forget. But African metals like that are kind of hard to find elsewhere. But the company was mainly just controlling the territory for the empire and railroad and agriculture.
Okay, so they had this self rule. So what was the governing structure of it, like say in 1920? Or you said they kind of declared independence in the 20s. You said
No, the Declaration of Independence came in 65. It was in
okay,
21 that the company decided just let them have local rule and become
okay,
a Commonwealth country rather than a company country.
okay.
Um,
What happened with that? Yeah, let's go into detail with what happened with that. What kind of structure did we have?
yeah, so it was a pretty normal Commonwealth country in terms of having a parliamentary legislature and a prime minister. The To vote, it was interesting in that instead of going along with Western liberal mass democracy, where just anyone can vote, it was much more a propertied voting system where to be able to qualify to vote, you had to have a certain amount of property or a certain level of educational attainment. And so it limited the franchise to those who were responsible. So unlike South Africa, where it was racial, there was no racial restriction. It was just a propertied or educational, that sort of thing, voting system. And they ran like that up until 69.
So obviously, a government that protects property, or where only the property owners can vote, is going to protect the right of private property. How much? What was the property requirement here?
I don't remember. It
Yeah,
was, that's not really focused on in anything was what it was. It was more that they had one,
yeah.
because most other Western countries had drifted away from that in the 1830s. So they
Well,
were
I mean,
unique in that they retained it.
what was it? Just large plantation owners voting, or could the small farmer who had maybe an
No,
acre
like
vote?
a house would qualify you
Okay, a house would
for a small
qualify you.
farm.
And
That's
obvious,
it.
did that also extend, for example, to did it have to be actual landed property? I mean, for example, could ownership of assets, like let's say you don't own any property, but you may own a lot of stock, would that qualify or not?
You know, from what I understand, it was that it had to be Rhodesian property.
Okay,
So if it was Rhodesian company, like if you owned a Rhodesian small business or stock in a
yeah,
Rhodesian company, that might qualify you, but not if you were an American who moved there with
yeah,
Coca-Cola stock.
yeah. So okay, so what percentage of people were voting at the time?
I don't know.
Okay, and so since it was property owners, did that also mean, for example, if you know fathers at home, that means only the father has a vote, or does the wife have a vote too, or any adult children have a vote, or
I'm not sure how it worked for family voting. It
yeah,
was, from what I understand, the individual voter had to own the property.
yeah.
So families, I suppose, could decide how to split it.
And so this was the system that started in the 20s, and it was maintained up through the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And
Hmm.
uh, I've heard things people say like that Rhodesia was almost a utopia in Africa, and it was a really, really great
Hmm.
place to be. How easy was it? How capitalistic was this country? I mean, did the people who had the vote work hard to stay that way? I mean, how easy if let's say I'm born to a poor sharecropper or something, and I want to event, how easy would it have been for me to eventually work my way up into becoming a landowner and then being able to vote?
Well, so part of the issue is that, or not issue, part of the situation was that it was this very large relative to like a European country, African nation
Yes.
that was primarily land that could be used for farming. And there was a very small population. At most, there were 250,000 Europeans and a couple million blacks, most of whom lived in tribal villages. So it was quite small. So if you think like the amount of territory that could be owned was quite large, and the amount that could be farmed was quite large. So rather than having like sharecroppers in the way we did, where it was pretty much all the poor whites and blacks after the Civil War had to be doing that,
Yeah.
if you had any amount of resources, it was pretty easy to buy land and it was pretty easy to farm it because there was a large amount of African labor that wanted something to do part of the time or wanted the cash from something to do for a part-time job. So it was pretty easy to get a farm up and going if that's what you wanted to do, or to buy land to build a house if that's what you wanted to do. It was much more like if you think about America in the 1860s when railroads were starting to be built. So the vast Midwest could be opened up and people could go out there and buy land quite cheaply, if it wasn't given to them. It was more like that, where it was a very attainable way to acquire land was to move to Rhodesia, which is why they had restrictive immigration policies because they didn't want the very poor showing up and causing trouble for the government. But if you had any amount of resources and were in the country, it was pretty easy to buy land.
But even if very poor people did show up, there probably weren't any a large network of handouts to incentivize them to come. So
yeah, they had restrictive immigration policy. They didn't want those people showing up.
But generally, as I pointed out earlier, where property owners vote, you're not going to have a lot of socialism, because in America, almost as soon as every adult male got to vote, the movement to vote yourself a farm came out of that. Vote your because the federal government had all these Western lands. So if you had the money, it was fairly easy to acquire land. And of course, anybody could buy land. I mean, white, black, there was never anything racial about this.
It only became racial when they were trying to encourage blacks to buy land. The Duke of Montrose, who was British, moved there because he despised England's socialist policies, and he became their agricultural commissioner. And part of his reform was setting aside about half the arable land for Africans to buy if they wanted to, because there were a lot of rumors that the Rhodesians weren't selling farmland to blacks, which was untrue. And the Africans were kind of hard to stimulate into activity like that. So they thought that would make it easier. It somewhat worked and somewhat didn't, but they did try to get the blacks to buy land.
Do you know what percentage of people were eligible to vote at the time?
I don't remember.
Yeah. Okay, so we go from here. So, what was life in Rhodesia like in the 20s and 30s? Was it pretty much like life? It probably wasn't exactly like life in Britain, but maybe it was like life in Britain 20 years earlier.
The life in Britain comparison is pretty accurate because land was so cheap, people could show up and buy large estates like the lords had in England, where houses were somewhat separated from each other, and either house parties or clubs would be the central meeting point. So as opposed to like America, where there are a lot of neighborhoods, it was much more somewhat separated landed estates where people would travel around and socialize. The difference was that the African veldt is a harsher place than the English pastoral landscape. So, I mean, for one, you have to deal with lions, but then additionally, they were carving civilization out of virgin land. So the amenities of English life weren't necessarily there until they built them. So it was much more a case-by-case basis of what exactly life was like. But you could compare it to England in, say, 1870, before the agricultural depression, when wealthy farmers would have parties and people would travel around to the different country houses.
A place like that self-selects. I mean, you're also not going to get, because people understand that moving to a place like that is going to be hard work. And so you're not going to get lazy people going to a place like that, I don't think. At least
no. There was one large city, Salisbury, which I believe now is known as Harare. But other than that, it was pretty much, and they were industrializing and had some of an industrial economy, but it was largely agrarian, and that farming was their real value driver. So it's somewhat selected for people who wanted to be managing large farming estates and were good at doing that. Ian Smith, who became the prime minister, is a good example, because somewhat like Cincinnatus or George Washington, all he wanted to do was retire to his farm, but kept being called for government service.
And I suppose, before World War II, they were mostly going there by boat and maybe by a train once they got to Africa, or what?
Yeah, the typical route would be, if you've ever read Churchill's Portsmouth to Pretoria via Ladysmith, you would sail down, if you're British, to South Africa, land at one of the many ports. Cape Town and Durban are two good examples.
Yeah.
And then from there, you could take a railway up into Rhodesia. Afterwards, once air travel was the thing, it was pretty easy to land either by plane or boat in South Africa, and then fly from South Africa into Salisbury, or drive up there.
Did Churchill spend any time there?
No, he spent time in South Africa during the Boer War. I don't believe he traveled to Rhodesia, though he was in Mozambique, from what I remember, Portuguese East Africa.
Yeah. Well, did South African politics have any impact on Rhodesia? I mean, like the Boer War or anything like that, or was it?
That didn't really. It only started to have an effect later on.
Okay.
Once apartheid became a thing in South Africa in 1948, and then during the Bush War itself, when they had to deal with the South Africans a great deal.
Okay, so Rhodesia is pretty much just kind of keeping it to itself. I have heard that a lot of Rhodesians actually joined Britain during World War II, and they were in
Mhm.
some cases had a reputation for being really great fighters,
Yes,
really
both in
great
World War One
soldiers.
and Two, they were known as being good fighters. In World War Two, it was somewhat different in that it's opposed to being infantry. Since it was a small country with small
Yeah,
units, I think my impression is that they focused a great deal more on air power and competence in being fighter pilots. And so Ian Smith, for example, was a Spitfire pilot, and there was a large contingent, or relatively large given their size of the country, contingent of British pilots, particularly Spitfire pilots who served in the Mediterranean during World War II.
yeah. So they had pilots and people serving in the war, and so really, yeah. So things are pretty much normal. But then after World War II ended, things in the West and Britain really started to change. You said that, but it's interesting. You talked about how some people who moved to Rhodesia because they were disgusted with
Yeah.
British socialism. Was that becoming the way that they were disgusted with socialism in Britain, so they were going to Rhodesia? Is that pretty common? And maybe you had a somewhat anti-socialist attitude there just because of that.
Yeah. So if you look at what happened in Great Britain between like 1893 and 1960 or
Yeah,
so, is death duties, which is what they call death taxes, went up from being absolutely nothing to like 90%. So the great lords who controlled these large estates of, say, 100,000 acres or 10,000 acres of arable land were having trouble sending that to their sons, either as gift during life or upon death, because it would just be taxed away to nothing. There were some ways to avoid it, but they really hated dealing with it and hated dealing with the 90% or so income taxes placed on them during that time. So if you read about the British landed elite in the period, both the titled peers and the gentry, a surprising number of that class of people decided to either sell some assets in Britain or use excess wealth to buy large estates in Rhodesia and move there because they could live how they wanted to live. As I mentioned earlier, it was these large arable estates, which they quite liked living on. And they could move to Rhodesia and do that without having to worry about taxation in the same way. I forget what Rhodesia's tax rate was at the time, but it was much less a problem than Britain's. And so, because of that, they quite liked moving to Rhodesia. And since it was restrictive on immigration, it maintained the social life they liked, which is English rather than South Africa's Dutch Boer
yeah.
type of society.
What it sounds like to me is that it probably wasn't very easy to say immigrate from the Congo or Mozambique or Southwest Africa, but it was fairly easy for anybody British to go there. Is that fair to say? Or
Yeah, their immigration policy was specifically that they only wanted to allow people to immigrate who they thought would assimilate into Rhodesian culture, which Rhodesian
yeah,
culture was described as more British than the British.
yes,
And it was also somewhat more upper class than lower class because of the landed estate society. So if you're an English South African, you potentially could move in. The Portuguese, don't really get the impression that they were moving down. Once decolonization started, a good number of refugees fled from the Congo into Rhodesia, which is part of what sparked their unilateral declaration of independence because they didn't want to deal with decolonization. But before then, and before the Bush War started, they were very restrictive in their immigration policy.
okay. Did they sometimes maybe attract English speakers from maybe say other countries? I mean, maybe they English speakers from Kenya or English speakers from Tanzania, or Australia, or New Zealand, or or was it?
If you read about British colonial Africa at the time, the different colonies kind of had the different characteristics.
Yeah,
Someone who moved to Kenya might be of the same class as someone
yeah,
who moved to Rhodesia, but they moved to Kenya because that's what they preferred. And it was a good bit more libertine, the Kenyan society
yeah.
was, in terms of like they were mainly centered around one large club community type thing in Kenya. And there's a lot of debauchery going on, and in the way that the Rhodesians weren't really known for that. So they might have been able to immigrate, but they largely chose Kenya because they wanted to be in Kenya and part of its culture rather than the somewhat or largely different Rhodesia. And similarly for Uganda, it was a somewhat
Yeah.
different place than Rhodesia.
Yeah, and It generally seems like the British colonies are better off than most of the other colonies. I don't know why. Maybe that's because of some common law traditions that were implemented there, but or whatever Britain left for them. But I mean, but we won't get into that. So World War II is over, and when do things start to change in Rhodesia? Because a lot of times after World War II, it seems like a lot of the colonies were becoming independent. What was happening in Rhodesia after? Also, I assume there wasn't a lot of welfare. I mean, were there things like, let's ask this too, were there handouts, Social Security? Was there National Health Service and all this other crap, or was it pretty much a capitalist country?
I don't know about their health service. It's never really come up in anything, so I don't get the impression it was a big deal. As for welfare, the government did want to try and make the African community a little bit better off and not as backwards as it was.
Yeah.
So the government did contribute to try and increasing infrastructure in the villages and increasing paved roads and that sort of thing. But it wasn't really welfare in the way it wasn't Section 8 housing in the tribal villages. It was more trying to build wells and roads, which was a little bit more productive use of, if you want to call that welfare, than welfare money. But it is a very different situation than we have or the British have.
Build it, maybe nice plumbing and stuff like that. But those are hands up more than they're hands out. But yes,
right.
But those things do help, and they help everybody. But so what happens after when we get into the end of World War II in the 1950s? And some of the independence movements start.
So it was somewhat different in Rhodesia than in the others because the white Rhodesians had relatively good relations with the Africans inside Rhodesia, whereas in Kenya and Uganda, it was a bit more hostile because of just different circumstances. So then Britain at the end of World War II, because it had decided to continue participating in the war and to do so in the way it did, was broke. I mean, during 1940, they were melting wedding rings to send America as gold payment for arms and such.
Yes.
So it lacked the resources to continue developing and holding on to the empire largely, and it also lacked the will to do so. In part, that was socialism and wanting to fund the NHS rather than build railroads in Kenya. But it was also that they saw imperialism as a net bad or net evil rather than net good. So they wanted to give up their colonies. That, though, was much more like a 50s type of thing and 60s type of thing, because during World War II, Rhodesia, in exchange for its service in the war, had been promised that it could declare independence if it wanted to, and that it could do so on its own terms rather than being told what to do by the British government. It chose not to because it thought that being part of the Commonwealth would be a good decision, just economically for it. That came back to bite it because once decolonization really got going in the 50s and 60s, the British state no longer wanted to continue supporting its propertied rule system. They saw that as being evil in comparison to mass democracy, which mass democracy would have empowered the Africans as opposed to just the property holders, both white and African. And so it became a problem. And the decolonization really got going in the early 60s, and particularly the Belgian Congo. The Belgians just decided to be done with it and up and left one day. And that devolved into chaos, particularly the Simba Rebellion, which I believe was in 1965. And because of that, the Belgians who survived fled from the Congo, and a good number of them fled from the Congo into Rhodesia, which the Rhodesians saw that and decided they didn't want to go down the same path as the Congo. They didn't want to decolonize. They wanted to remain a pretty much white rule state that they thought would be more responsible and less likely to devolve into anarchy. Well, so that's when their kind of spat with Britain began, because they wanted to declare independence on their own terms, whereas Britain wouldn't let them declare independence until they agreed to majority rule.
Yeah, let's say it wasn't necessarily a white ruled state. It was just a property ruled state.
Right.
But a lot of the property owners happen to be white,
Well, that I more meant that the government, particularly Ian Smith's Rhodesian Front government, included a lot of tribal chiefs in advisory positions, but the cabinet was largely white, large landholders like the Duke of Montrose and Ian Smith. And so it was, that was majority white. the voting base was somewhat different because
Yes.
they're white and black property owners.
But
So
there
the blacks
wasn't
were voting
anything.
for the whites to do that
Yeah,
and be in the
I'm just
rafters.
saying there wasn't anything though that barred
Right. Yes.
non-whites from
Yes.
being in these
Exactly.
positions. It just happened that way. It wasn't,
Right. It was organic.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. So yeah, so they saw what happened in the Congo, which is from what I've heard, one of the most dangerous places in the world where you can visit, and it's still and of course that was north of, and that's sometimes been the Congo, sometimes it's been Zaire, which is right north of Zambia, which was the northern part of Rhodesia at the time.
Right.
So Rhodesia was actually Zambia and Zimbabwe, so that was a fairly large region,
Right.
and also bordered on the east side by Malawi and a little bit, and Mozambique, as you pointed out, Botswana on the southwest, and Angola and Namibia on the southwest as well. So that was the geography of the whole situation. So they saw what happened in the Congo, and what exactly happened in the Congo. The Belgians just left, and so Congo went communist, or what?
That would be giving it a veneer of government control that it didn't have. First, Katanga, which is the resource-rich part of the country, tried breaking away. It was largely non-communist, and the main government was somewhere between communist and just authoritarianism. Once the UN settled that and Katanga didn't break away, the Simba rebellion began. The
Yes.
Simbas weren't like communists. They were just crazed Africans who would take drugs and then go rape, loot, and murder. And Mike Hoare, who was a South African mercenary, and his 5 commando unit largely put them down. But it took a while, and during that time, the Belgians had a large number of like nunneries and monasteries in the country to try and educate the local Africans and build infrastructure and such. And most of those were destroyed and the inhabitants tortured to death by the Simbas.
Yes.
So it was a chaotic situation. They kind of went communist. They kind of didn't. America tried to get involved in supporting one of the dictators. But the problem in the Congo is that it's a huge country and the government is entirely incompetent and quite weak and very corrupt. So few resources are devoted to building a competent and sustained army. And it's just kind of constant anarchy and turnover and violence rather than a communist country in the way we think of it, where there's authoritarian rule and the country is at least stable.
Yes. And yeah, the Simba revolt, Katanga. Yeah, there was a lot of things. And we're also talking, the Congo is also an area, I think, that's pretty much like the Amazon rainforest. In fact, there are theories that at one time before the continental drift that the Congo River and the Amazon were actually one river.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
Before, so you're talking about an area that really is very hard to do much of anything with. I mean, right now as we speak, there are gangs that just hang out in the Amazon rainforest. I mean, they're like pirates, but they're in the rainforest and nobody really messes with them.
Yeah, like the thing with the Congo was that if you had a competent army, you were able to control Katanga and the railroads leading into and out of it. So you were able to get something out of the country. But if you're unwilling or unable to maintain those roads and railroads and bases and all that, then it quickly falls apart because, as you said, it's a jungle. So the jungle will creep back in. But the rebels are just so incompetent compared to a Western military force that whether it's the Belgians or Mike Hoare or pretty much any other group with even the slightest degree of competence, they're not really a problem. It's more that you have to maintain the infrastructure well and constantly.
Oh yeah, the jungles. It's a great equalizer too. It doesn't really care if you're rich or you're poor. Just
yeah, the bugs don't. It doesn't. Yeah,
the bugs.
Horrible place.
Oh yeah, the bugs, the malaria, all that nice stuff. The yellow fever. Yeah. So really, you end up in this. So obviously, Rhodesia didn't want to go down the route of the Congo. So what was going on then? And it sounds like Britain was maybe starting to say we don't like what's happening there because this is still not a democracy. It's a proprietarian government, we could call it.
Right. So if you think about Britain after World War II, there was Attlee, who was a socialist who destroyed the country, and then Churchill and Anthony Eden, both of whom did very little to restore its fortunes, and then Wilson, I think it's Harold Wilson, who was horrible, and he was like Attlee, just awful socialist. And so over that time, Britain became a socialist country. It was allied with the US, but it was friendly to socialism abroad. And also, ever since the Parliament Bill in 1911, it had been a committed egalitarian country. That was part of the reason for the punitive death duties on the lords, is that they hated that they existed at that point. It's somewhat changed now. But they despised that idea that blood might matter, or that heredity might matter, or that, just any of the hereditary principle stuff. And so because of that, they disliked Rhodesia and that it wasn't egalitarian, and instead said that to vote doesn't matter if you're black or white, but you do have to show that you're responsible either through the acquisition of wealth or the stewardship of it, which Britain hated that idea. They thought that it should just be an egalitarian country. So Wilson, his whole policy was no independence before majority rule, or NIMR. And he refused to let Rhodesia break away from the British Commonwealth until it adopted majority rule, which would have meant rule by, at that point, Mugabe and his communists, because they could just terrify people into voting for them. So Ian Smith at that point was the prime minister, and he was a World War II war hero and landowner. And he refused to go along with that because he thought it would lead to the same thing it had led to in the Congo, which was one man, one vote, one time. And then after that, just chaos, crime, and anarchy. So Rhodesia in 1965, I believe in November of 1965, unilaterally broke away from the British Commonwealth and became the independent Republic of Rhodesia. Zambia had already broken away from it. So there were two countries at that point. Once it did so, it received global opprobrium because both the United States and Britain were egalitarian democracies that hated that it would have property voting. And the communists, both the Chinese who backed Mugabe and the Russians who backed Nkomo, who was another communist leader, hated it because it wasn't a communist state. So at that point, from 1965, it was facing the world, which wanted to destroy it. The only countries that fought alongside it were Portugal, which at that point was still ruled by Salazar and controlled Mozambique and Angola. So Ian Smith and Salazar were close allies. The Israelis refused to go along with the UN sanctions on Rhodesia and supported it regardless of kind of global unrest. And then South Africa, because it was to Rhodesia South and quite similar in terms of outlook and being against African communism, supported Rhodesia for most of the war, though there was trouble towards the end.
So Zambia, as you pointed out, Zambia broke off, and for a while I know it was called Southern Rhodesia because Zambia.
It is Northern Rhodesia.
Yeah,
Zambia
had been Northern Rhodesia. Why did Zambia break off?
It had less of a Rhodesian style desire for that sort of thing. There weren't as many farmers there. It was somewhat different and just ruled under the Rhodesia umbrella, but because it was primarily black and wanted to break away, the British let it do so.
So is Zambia, what's the situation like in Zambia right now? Or is it?
Right now, it's relatively fine. For a short time after it broke away, up until about Mugabe's time as dictator, it was a communist country and allied with the communists attempting to destroy Rhodesia. But then things got pretty bad there. And once the Rhodesian farmers were starting to flee in like 79 and 1980, Zambia changed course and started letting them in because it wanted their agricultural expertise. And so since then, it hasn't been great, but it's been a more stable country than Zimbabwe.
So and let's see, Harold Wilson was prime minister from 64 to 70 and then 74 to 76. Ian Smith was prime minister from 64 to 79. Interesting enough, assumed office on the 13th of April, which is also Thomas Jefferson's birthday. From there, you talked about what was this war that suddenly happened? You said there was a war, or there was fighting after Rhodesia basically said we're declaring independence whether you let us have it or not, and then what happened?
Yeah, so there were a number of wars in the region. The Portuguese were fighting communist rebels both in Angola and Mozambique. The Mozambique war was more relevant to Rhodesia because it was a border of Rhodesia. the communists at that point were being backed by both the communist Russians and the Red Chinese, and so had arms and advisors and the ability to start trying to subvert Rhodesia internally and attack it externally. So from when it declared independence or thereabouts in 64, 65 up until 1974, it was a low-grade insurgency, somewhat like the Malaysian emergency the British defeated. There were incursions by communist rebels, mainly based out of Zambia, who would attack Rhodesian farms, plant mines in the roads, try and weaken its industry and agricultural ability. So that was a low-grade insurgency. Then Portugal under Salazar fell to the socialists in 1974 in the Carnation Revolution.
Yeah.
And the socialists gave up Mozambique and Angola to the communists. So at that point, except for South Africa, Rhodesia was entirely bordered by communists in the Zambia and Mozambique. So the war escalated dramatically because there was all that more territory the rebels could infiltrate from, and in which they could regroup, resupply, be backed and trained by the communists, and then attack. So it was called the Bush War, and it went from 1964, 65 to 1980, but it really took off in 1974.
Yeah, and of course, this was also when Robert Mugabe started to become. I noticed it looks like early in his career, he was a college professor. Isn't that just lovely?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, and apparently they even arrested Mugabe a few times during all this.
He was in prison for a great deal of it. They could have just executed him, but
yeah,
they didn't, and so he ended up destroying the country.
Our mercy ends up backfiring on us. I mean, I don't know if maybe there'd just been somebody else, but what would happen, if they had killed him? I mean,
both Nkomo and Mugabe were in jail at one point or another and could have just been shot. And they were the leaders of those movements that probably would have fallen apart without them. So because of their dedication to British style rule of law and all that, they didn't shoot them despite it being a war, much to their detriment.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, because of their not wanting to execute people.
It brings to mind the famous story where I forget which conference it was, but Chamberlain was speaking to Hitler and complaining about Gandhi in India. And Hitler said, "Why don't you just shoot him?" And Chamberlain thought it was a joke and started laughing because it was so inappropriate. And Hitler wasn't joking. And he said, "No, I mean it. Why didn't you just shoot them?" And so that played out a lot of times in the British Empire, where it just viewed as beyond the pale the shooting of rebel leaders, whereas others probably would have done it.
Yeah, I think even 1800 Britain might have done that, but yeah, they certainly wouldn't have. They certainly would have done it to George Washington if they could have.
Well, and they did it during the Sepoy Mutiny in India.
Yeah.
In the Zulu War and all that. They would have done it had it been before World War II, probably. But because it was after and they were kind of morally and financially weak, they didn't want to do it anymore. And the Rhodesians kind of inherited that unwillingness.
Yeah. And so the Soviets and the Chinese communists are funding the communists in Rhodesia, and the alleged democracies are also supporting at least these communists. Did it ever occur to these people like these so-called Democrats in the West that why are we funding the same side as the Chinese and Soviet communists? Did something ever click in their head, or did they just ignore that?
It was intentional mostly. They knew what they were doing. The British, as I mentioned earlier, were so egalitarian by that point. They just couldn't tolerate Rhodesia, and they also couldn't tolerate its desire to hold on to just the vestiges of imperial rule and imperial grandeur. America was going through the civil rights revolution at that point, and a lot of those guys were backed by the communists as well. But once it succeeded, they started having to be included in the government and government decisions. Andy Young was particularly involved in Rhodesia's destruction. And so they were not at all worried about the communist connection, in large part because they also had a communist connection. And so they kept pushing for Rhodesia's destruction, and the US government applied its own civil rights lens, quite incorrectly given the situation, to Rhodesia and was okay with destroying it. I think in large part that's because liberal democracy and communism are both egalitarian in worldview. So it overlaps a great deal and isn't, It's not really as much in conflict as it might appear at first glance.
Liberal democracy can have a lot of different forms. So who was Andy Young?
He was an Atlanta civil rights personality. He was close with Carter, Jimmy Carter, which became a problem for Rhodesia because he became president in 76, which is really when the Bush War was taking on its final form of being a desperate struggle between communism and freedom.
Yes.
But Young, because of his civil rights worldview, said that Rhodesia's government was intolerable and Carter should destroy it. And he kept backing Mugabe and Nkomo even as they committed atrocities. And so Carter was one who really clamped down on Rhodesia, and he refused to go along at all with maybe trying to help it stop the spread of communism, because to him and to a lot of others, the civil rights angle was more important than the freedom angle.
Yes, it's much more. We need democracy. Yes, we need to have democracy. And you know, Jimmy, and there were some legitimate, grievances in the South, I think. But Jimmy Carter saw those. I suppose his Southern upbringing might have impacted that, because that was when really Rhodesia became Zimbabwe, when Jimmy Carter was president.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, what do you think the West could have done differently? That might.
Well, that's easy. It was a lot of Rhodesia's destruction stemmed from the sanction and embargo.
Yeah.
So the UN, in its first ever sanctions, passed mandatory sanctions on Rhodesia, which the US and Britain and France aided and abetted. They voted for it. That meant that any nation that wanted to remain in good standing in the UN had to go along with the sanctions. The only countries that refused, as I mentioned earlier, were Portugal, Israel, and South Africa. So because of that, Rhodesia couldn't really import arms or supplies, nor could it export its cash crops, which up to then it had been known for growing tobacco and wheat. So it could no longer earn foreign exchange to trade on global markets. Additionally, the British went a step above and beyond and sent their warships to patrol the port of Beira in Mozambique, which the Rhodesians had a pipeline at. And so they could import oil through Beira so long as the oil tankers could get in, but the British kept trying to block them. And so the Rhodesians, once Mozambique fell, they ran out of oil, which was a large reason for their demise. The West, had it wanted to preserve Rhodesia, would have just had to not go along with sanctions or an embargo and let it exist as a country and trade. They wouldn't have even had to aid it. They could have just let it be alone and buy arms if it wanted.
And I don't know, you mentioned, obviously Salazar. I didn't realize he was, because Salazar had something that was pretty much like Franco in Spain, although he's not as well known, because
he's one who's called a fascist.
Yeah,
but that's inaccurate. He's much more like Putin, in that it's just kind of bureaucratic management that does a reasonably good job in a tough situation.
Yeah,
somewhat like Putin restored Russia's fortunes in the wake of just the disaster of the 90s. Now it's different, but for the first few decades, he did a reasonably good job at that. Salazar was similar in that he wasn't so much ideological as he just wanted to restore the country to somewhat what it had been, and he was opposed completely to communism.
Yeah.
So Ian Smith and Salazar were close, and Smith called him a perfect gentleman. He was very much unlike Hitler or Mussolini or the other fascists. Lee Kuan Yew would be another good example of someone like Salazar.
Lee Kuan Yew was Hong Kong, I believe.
Singapore.
Yeah. That's one thing, people tell me, who basically just say, Singapore is a place just where everything works, it's.
Yeah.
And a lot of times that's just what people want to live in a country where as they said about Mussolini, where the trains run on time.
Yeah, exactly.
It's, where the trains.
I think a lot of Americans have trouble contemplating it because things were so good here, but somewhere like Spain, where just civil war had destroyed the country, or Singapore, where they'd be invaded by Malaysia if they didn't do everything right. It makes a lot more sense that you just care if things worked than care about how you got to them working.
Well, you have to have things work too if you want to be able to fight wars or keep your country open,
or not starve, as happened to Zimbabwe.
Curious, why was Israel on the side of Rhodesia during all this?
That's hard to find about because no one wants to talk about it, just because it's kind of an awkward situation. From what I gather, having tried to dig into it and read about it, the Israelis were close with the South Africans, as most people know. They collaborated with their nuclear programs. and with other experiments in trying to keep a population down. The South Africans with apartheid and the Israelis with the Palestinians shared a lot of tactics. So Israel and South Africa were close, and because of that, the Israelis were willing to deal with Rhodesia in the same way that the South Africans were. Though I think, from what I gather, somewhat more at arm's length. But from what I can tell, it was mainly because Israel is constantly at odds with the UN, and also because Israel was close with South Africa.
Israel and South Africa, of course, were apartheid. South Africa, of course, were very, very similar, as
Right.
Bishop Desmond Tutu once pointed out. But Rhodesia was, and there wasn't anybody in Africa who was on the side of Rhodesia during all this, or everybody wanted.
No, at that point, other than South Africa, everywhere had fallen. The Portuguese, Angola, and Mozambique were allied with Rhodesia and fighting alongside it for much of the war. But once they fell in '74, there was nowhere left other than South Africa.
Yeah, although not a Brazilian, not a colony at the time. Did Brazil? Were they on the side of Rhodesia? Although they weren't a Portuguese colony at the time, they're still the very largest Portuguese-speaking country in the world.
No, they went along with the sanctions. A lot of the countries didn't really care. I mean, like, did Brazil care about Rhodesia?
Yeah.
No, but it also cares much more about being able to trade with America or getting aid dollars from America or whatever. So it went along with the sanctions, even if it wasn't particularly excited about it.
So basically what happens is if say the US, the UK, and France say we've got this country's evil, everybody else just kind of goes along with it.
Some cared less than others. Like Greece, for example, was known for having oil tankers that would try and slip into Beira past the UK Navy.
Yeah,
often to great success, which is funny since it's just like an oil tanker and it's the supposedly vaunted Royal Navy. But Greece technically went along with sanctions. That was more informal. In some cases, it was similar. Like right-wing Americans would smuggle either themselves or weapons into Rhodesia to fight the communists. But that was informal. That wasn't a national policy.
They were smuggling weapons. So, and assume also the Germans and the Italians were probably against Rhodesia as well.
Yes, yeah.
Any assistance from the, since they seem to hate the West, like Iran or Saudi Arabia or anybody like that was on the side of Rhodesia or not?
The Saudis, I don't think really cared. They more were dealing with the U.S. Part of it was that a large portion of this took place during the Iran-Iraq war and then also the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. So that region had its own problems that it was dealing with. It wasn't, or I guess the invasion of Afghanistan was 79, not 69. But anyway, the region had its own kind of issues, both with Israel and with the Russians and with the Americans and with each other. So it didn't really play any of a role in the conflict.
Yeah. What was Margaret Thatcher's take on all this?
She came into power too late to have much of an impact. The Ian Smith in his book famously said that the Rhodesians had been stabbed in the back as much by the conservatives as by the laborites. Whatever conservative prime minister preceded Thatcher, who was the one in between Wilson's two terms, was as intransigent as Wilson in terms of actually helping the Rhodesians. The only counter to that was the House of Lords voted down the sanctions against Rhodesia. Because of Churchill and Lloyd George's 1911 Parliament bill, that veto was only temporary.
Yes.
At that point, it could only be for a year rather than total. But so for a year, the Lords held it up and voted against it. But then after the year was up, they couldn't do anything. So
Edward Heath was also terrible, is what you're telling me.
Yes, yeah.
So then by the time, as you pointed out, there really wasn't much she could have done at that point. Unfortunately, the damage had already been done.
Yeah, Reagan is the only Western leader who, had he been there in time, might have done things differently. He famously refused to vote or go along with the sanctions against South Africa, though Congress overrode his veto, excuse me. But Reagan might have had a different take. Thatcher, I think, would have gone along with the British egalitarian disposition against Rhodesia.
And there was also James Callaghan.
Was he British?
He was after Wilson, but before Thatcher.
Okay.
So you mentioned the House of Lords. There wasn't anybody in the Commons speaking out against this. It was pretty much
There might have been a few minor voices, but it was the lords were the only ones who offered any significant resistance.
And I can imagine everywhere the so-called educated people were probably all talking about how horrible Rhodesia was.
Yes.
Whether they be at Oxford or whether they be at Harvard or whatever, or wherever else they were probably saying, all this is so horrible. They need democracy.
Yeah.
Isn't it so interesting how it's always the socialists who are pushing for democracy?
Yeah.
Has anybody caught that? I think people are catching that by now. So really, once this all happens around 79, eventually Rhodesia becomes Zimbabwe. What's the origin of that name, by the way?
I believe that's the local tribal African name, is whatever it originally was in the, I guess it would have been the Shona or Ndebele language. It was called what in English translates to Zimbabwe.
Yeah. Are there a lot of different languages in Zimbabwe now, or were there a lot of different languages there? If it's like most African countries, there probably were.
Well, theoretically, there are. Mugabe, when he came to power, one of his first actions was the Gurukundi, which was the genocide of the Ndebele tribe, because the Ndebele had supported Nkomo, his communist rival. So now it is a much more Shona country than anything else, because that was Mugabe's tribe. So it used to have some variety, but now, from what I gather, it's everyone is either speaking English or Shona.
So we have another case of the communists killing other communists. Isn't that just lovely?
Yes, that's the eternal fight between the Trotskyites and
if
Stalinists.
only it would happen more often. Nkomo, what was this, like a Menshevik Bolshevik thing, or what was it? Or kind of like Stalin Trotsky, or I don't know.
It wasn't that ideological. They came from different tribes and each wanted to be in charge, and the different communist powers backed different ones. So the Chinese communists backed Mugabe, which is why he was later able to bring in I think a division or two of North Korean troops to help him with the Gurukundi.
Oh.
Whereas the Soviets backed Nkomo. So it was just not an ideological split. It was an ethnic split, and they were backed by different powers that let them keep fighting.
Oh, okay. So that was interesting. Were Rhodesians pretty much armed, or what was the situation with people? Did everybody have a gun, or?
Yeah, they not everyone. Most of the white farmers had guns. The villages were somewhat different because they didn't really have the resources to buy guns, and the country was shut off from the outside, where the government could just import a bunch of weapons and arm everyone. The white farmers were largely, and they would arm their laborers. So there are a lot of funny pictures of Africans fully kitted out with gear and G3s standing guard over golf courses and stuff. But generally those were armed who wanted to be and had the resources to be. So a lot of the farmers, because it was a Commonwealth country, they were somewhat less tolerant of complete gun rights than Americans would be. So there was a national register of guns that ended up biting them when Mugabe was in charge, because he used it to just confiscate everyone's weapons.
Of course he did. So Mugabe pretty much took over in around 79 or 80, right? I mean,
yeah, Ian Smith first handed power to a different African guy who was more willing to work with the former Rhodesian government. I forget his name, and he wasn't in power very long. Then, so that was the first election. Mugabe then declared that was an unfair election and that he should have another shot at it, which the Americans and British backed him with. And so with his second election, he sent his thugs around the country to go encourage people to vote for him. So they all did so because they'd be killed. And then he became president.
So when was the first the first democratic election?
79.
79. So that was when. And who was this person who tried to, at least didn't want to completely destroy everything?
I can never remember his name. He wasn't really a big figure because he went away so quickly. And then it was Mugabe. He won in 1980.
Yeah, so it was just only like a year. But yeah, and Ian Smith, of course, was born and raised in Rhodesia. I mean, he was out on June 1st, 1979. Yeah. So then what happened as soon as what happened after that? It was there ever a truly democratic election after that, or was Mugabe just playing around with everything? So
No, Mugabe played around with it in the 1980 election, and then it was essentially just one man, one vote, one time, like most of the rest of Africa. So he became essentially dictator. He changed his title in the mid 1980s, I think, from prime minister to president. But he was just in complete control and used his thuggish military to support him.
And this went on until 2017 when he finally died.
Right.
And we want to point out Ian Smith is not the same Ian Smith who was arrested in New Jersey for opening his gym.
Yeah.
This is a different Ian Smith. This Ian Smith, unfortunately, is no longer with us. But so what happened? Obviously, things didn't fall apart immediately, but Mugabe certainly set it in motion. I mean, what happened after that?
It was pretty close to immediately. Well, so first there was the Gurukundi, and that was how he secured power amongst the African natives, was by killing the opposing tribes. Then there was gun confiscation, which he used the National Gun Registry for. Then it was really in the 90s, so about a decade or two late. And so things throughout that time were getting worse and worse economically because he was a communist and his thugs would do whatever they wanted. So it kept getting worse and worse. Then came the land confiscation in the 90s, which is really when things like completely fell apart. And that was where his followers wanted their rewards from serving him. So he just hit them to take what farms they wanted. And it ended up in a pretty total confiscation of white land for the benefit of his followers. The problem is that they didn't know how to farm. I think it was John Kerry who described farming as like sticking corn in the ground and waiting for it to grow or something.
Yes.
But, that's inaccurate entirely. And so the Africans, I don't even know if they tried to do that, but they had control of these farms. They didn't know how to farm. And so the farms fell apart, which was a big problem because Rhodesia had only been able to import things because it sold crops for foreign exchange. Once it was no longer producing crops under Mugabe, it could no longer sell anything for foreign exchange. So it fell apart pretty quickly. And that ended in the famous hyperinflation and also in famine.
So that's pretty, and by then nobody really, and of course, all the same people who probably were, supportive of Mugabe were now telling that they all say this isn't real democracy or this is real socialism or what. Interestingly enough, though, I've also read that while Israel was very supportive of Ian Smith, they were also very supportive of Mugabe. Is that what's up with that?
I really don't know about their relations with Mugabe. I only know that they were trading partners of Rhodesia, but once they no longer had the South African nuclear program to care about, they really stopped working with the former colonial governments in the region. So, South Africa, once it no longer had nukes and apartheid, Israel didn't really have anything to gain from it.
Yeah. So now Zimbabwe is pretty much just like the rest of Africa.
It has the one benefit. One thing that separates it is because relations were generally quite good between the native Africans and the Europeans. There was never a white genocide in the same way that there is now in South Africa, or there had been in the Congo. It got kind of close when the farms were stolen, but it wasn't complete. And that was a government policy rather than a native policy.
Yeah.
So, or a native effort or whatever. And so when Mugabe died, the Trump administration pressured Zimbabwe, and it agreed to let the white farmers back in or pay them compensation for having left. And so a lot of the ones who had fled to Zambia or South Africa, which at that point in 2017, South Africa had already gotten even worse than Zimbabwe. A good number of them chose to immigrate back into Zimbabwe and set back up on their old farms. So it has improved somewhat since 2017, though not, I wouldn't want to live in Zimbabwe, but there's a good number of people who'd much prefer to live in Zimbabwe than live in South Africa.
Have you been to the country?
Mm-mm.
No, probably wouldn't want to go anyway. But so, what other lessons can we learn from all of this?
There are a few things. The first, I would say, and this is one of my more controversial takes, is that we look back at the Cold War and we're taught to believe that it was a fight between communism and democracy, or a communism and freedom. That's not really true. It was somewhat true in Korea, but that was really the last example of it. If you look at what America supported during the war and what the British supported during the Cold War, it wasn't so much freedom, because we were hostile to Rhodesia, hostile to South Africa, and semi-hostile to Singapore. It was much more that we wanted liberal democracy out of the world. And by liberal democracy, I mean, like, they didn't care so much about the rights of the people after the first vote, but they did care about the veneer of mass democracy and everyone being able to vote.
Yeah.
So in Vietnam, for example, we didn't support the French, even though they were far better than the communists. We instead, as shown in the book Background to Betrayal, kind of let the communists win, and then we went into South Vietnam and engaged in land reform that just destroyed the aristocracy there and eventually led to the communists winning. Much the same is true of Africa, where we didn't support freedom, we supported decolonization and a one vote mass democracy. So I think that's an important lens through which to view the Cold War, is when you look at what was happening and why things went so badly despite freedom supposedly winning. It's because it wasn't freedom, and we didn't care about freedom. We cared about the form of government, and that was a problem. The second thing is that complex systems are complex and can't be meddled with. Rhodesia only functioned, and it was the breadbasket of Africa, because people knew how to farm in a modern industrial way using modern fertilizers, modern methods, modern crops. And it was quite successful in that. And because it was successful, it could trade with the world and was prosperous. Once Mugabe started meddling with that, it fell apart. The third lesson is that a lot of people who profess to care about different things, whether it's liberal democracy or freedom or, whatever, the like Andy Young type stuff and Jimmy Carter type stuff, it's generally just their way to sneak into being able to destroy you. So if you think someone's opposed to you, they probably are. And they're just trying to use rhetoric to get you to lower your defenses. I think the Rhodesians, had they thought of those things in 1945, they probably would have just accepted independence and been a lot better off for it.
What would they have done with independence in 1945?
The British wouldn't have betrayed them. The problem was they were offered independence after World War II on good terms with Britain, and they didn't take it because they wanted to be part of the Commonwealth. Had they taken it then, the government probably wouldn't have cared as much in the 60s about democracy. And so the trading would have been easier, and they would have at least been better armed and better equipped and better ready to fight the communists.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. So they didn't, as you pointed out, they wanted to keep Britain as a trading partner. They did.
Right.
The state of Florida also rejected the revolution in 1776. They stayed with Britain. They said this is a bad idea. They wanted to keep their trade going. And it's tragic that we're still fighting these communists now. And I guess Africa was pretty much taken over by communists after all the countries gave them independence, which is why Africa's. And of course, who can blame them? Because all of the experts in the West, all of these college professors and people who have all these fancy degrees have all told them that capitalism is horrible, free markets are horrible. It's very important that you have a government that's run by experts like ourselves, college professors with PhDs and all. We'll run everything, and we'll just do a fantastic job. And that.
Yeah, the other thing is that these countries will periodically have like reasonable rulers who want to do a good job, and then they'll take great examples of this are both Angola and Sierra Leone. In the 80s, 90s, and so they were just chaotic hellholes. They didn't want to be like that, and their rulers were at least good enough to know that they shouldn't be like that and didn't have to be like that, because they hadn't been like that when the Portuguese were ruling and the British were ruling. So they brought in Eben Barlow's Executive Outcomes, which was somewhat like Blackwater, but even more heavily armed. And within a space of months, it was able to stamp out the insurgencies and stamp out the people who were cutting each other's limbs off and win. And it brought peace and stability to the region and to those countries. The problem was that, much like the Western governments were unable to tolerate Rhodesia because it was an affront to their sense of democracy, the UN and the same Western countries were unable to tolerate Eben Barlow and Executive Outcomes because they saw it as an affront to mass democracy. Wouldn't even be the right word, but to whatever the current like political correct thing is in America, where they couldn't tolerate that it was a majority white mercenary force bringing order to some African country. So they made Ibn Barlow leave, and luckily he'd somewhat succeeded in Angola. Sierra Leone wasn't completely pacified yet. So the UN went back in after Barlow, and it was a disaster. I mean, the UN mainly focused on like looting and raping and didn't bring any order. The rebels were doing the same. So the country was far worse for the people living there because Barlow had been forced out. And decolonization has a lot of the same lessons, where decolonization was so bad for the Africans because things became immeasurably worse for them once they'd gotten their supposed freedom than when they'd just been working with the like native chiefs working with the semi-European governments. It worked a lot better.
One thing I realize about the left is they don't really want to resort to violence. I think they want to achieve their goals via manipulation or, corrupting the language, or just lying, or making up history, or just they don't. And especially in the West now, they're so much against the whole idea of being a fighting person. Not to mention they hate men, and men are the fighters. So it's kind of a they want to gossip, shame, and rally and stuff like that. So it's really rather bizarre the way this is all happening. Have you paid attention to a lot of what's going on in Africa? What can you tell me about the rest of Africa right now?
Yeah, so after what I mentioned a bit ago with Sierra Leone and Angola and the executive outcomes, some of the continent stabilized a bit. Part of that is thanks to the Wagner Group, which has its problems, but has at least brought some degree of order to some of these places. Additionally, America has militarily gotten a bit more involved in some of them because of the war on terror. So in some of the countries that used to be awful, there's a little bit more order now, and it's somewhat better. The problem is that, like, say in South Africa, it's a big enough country and used to be prosperous enough where there's a good bit of social capital, or whatever you want to call it, to coast on, where it hasn't completely collapsed yet, as a lot of people predicted it would. But things keep getting worse and worse every year, where it probably will fall apart eventually, but that hasn't happened yet. So a lot of Africa is, I think, in that holding pattern where there's stuff it is able to hold on to, but it's not doing well.
Yeah, the big question for a lot of us now is it possible to have democracy and capitalism and freedom? And I don't know.
I don't think so.
I don't know if it is either.
Well, this is one thing that a lot of people have forgotten. The West, as we think of it, wasn't really built by democracy. England, up until 1936, was pretty much a landed elite voting and ruling. And even after 1836, up until the Second Reform Bill, was pretty much the upper middle class and the upper class voting. And that's when England was great. I mean, that's when it won the Napoleonic Wars. That's when it rebuilt the empire after losing America. That's when it conquered a lot of Africa and stabilized rule in India and held on to its possessions in Southeast Asia and China. And that's really when Britain became great. After then, it had a good bit to coast on, even as that former group that had made it great was attacked. Similarly, in America, we were kind of cobbled together by a landed elite in the wake of the Revolutionary War. And it was only Andrew Jackson who changed that. And even with him, it was somewhat different. I mean, we didn't get full voting until like 1960 with the Civil Rights Movement. The West wasn't built. It was largely built on responsible rule rather than mass democracy.
Well,
now we have mass democracy and it's not going well.
Well, you're also, there's also another factor too. I never asked you this. What was, you pointed out too, but the other thing too was, for a long time, it was also just men voting.
Yeah.
I don't know, Andrew Jackson, I don't believe Andrew Jackson is a social democrat at all.
No. Definitely not.
I think he's very much, I don't know if he read anything regarding economics, but he seems like a guy who really did believe in capitalism and just wanted to, he saw the bank as corporate welfare, and that's why he killed it.
No, I don't dislike Jackson. Just
sometimes, when you have, and this is a problem, is that sometimes when you do have undemocratic systems, there is corporate welfare, and there's nothing really to stop it. I don't want corporate welfare, and I I definitely think that corporate welfare existed before socialism did. And really, in a lot of cases, people just became socialists because this was a way to destroy. They saw it as the more effective way to fight corporate welfare.
Yeah, like I don't know as much about the continent just because it's so foreign to me. America is still largely an Anglo country and culture. The In Britain and America, I think a lot of what you get is egalitarianism.
Yeah.
Once things stabilized, where you no longer needed the barons. A great example of this, and I'm a little bit rambling, is the Percy family in the north of England. When the barons were a big deal and the Scots-Irish were still fighting as border reavers in the region, you needed a baron who was an intelligent guy who could sort it out. And so egalitarianism made no sense. Similarly, in America, you needed frontier leaders who could rally the men and go on the attack. Once things stabilized, those guys kind of lost their purpose, whether they had a title or not. And it became this, solidified hierarchy where they weren't really what they used to be. And it got a lot of people mad. And I think that's a lot of where you get socialism from, is that they saw it as unfair because of past achievements, and it turned into an issue.
Yeah. And some people, just had these advantages just because of the accent of birth. And I don't know what they would have done otherwise. But in some cases you also have, I think, when Andrew Jackson killed the bank, it was, they were rigging the system and trying to, and certainly inflation is the classic example, but I mean, one thing you can say about democracy is it always promotes inflation. It's
Oh yeah.
I mean, because democracy requires irresponsible spending and just giving stuff away, and then, well, you got to do it somehow. But what's been your reaction to talking about this? Does anybody really talk much about this, or is it just one of those things that people just want to forget ever happened?
No, I think people want to remember it. One thing that was really interesting was in the wake of a few threads that got like millions of views, I think people remembered Rhodesia again. So if you go on Twitter now, there's a great deal of Rhodesia content. Similarly, I've talked about Orania, which is the Afrikaner town in South Africa, and it's now getting some more attention on Twitter and elsewhere. I think people do care. They just, public schools, for obviously reasons, refuse to teach this, as do most private schools. So people don't know about it. But once they know about it, a lot of the lessons strike home, because it's hard not to see what happened there happening in America right now. As the meme goes, we're all Rhodesians now because they want to Mugabify the world.
That's a good way to put it. They do want to Mugabify the world. There is one person who seems to be, I hope, the antidote to all this. That's Javier Milei. Any opinions on him?
I know less about him than Bukele. I think the rise of both has been great for the region. Just since South America has seen such a leftist push, and Bukele, you see someone who's willing to fight the gangs and just like arrest them, and then revert to the hard money of Bitcoin rather than fiat. In Milei, you have someone who's slashed the government and has started to fight inflation and fight just government bureaucracy and overreach. So I think both are great. Also, like Lee Kuan Yew is a great example of someone who is competent or could do things. So there's people like that. You just have to find a way to get them into power.
I think that was largely what motivated the invention of cryptocurrency. It says, well, because they realized we cannot have a gold standard and have a democracy. So can we figure out some standard that cannot be broken by democracy?
Well, and additionally, I mean, this is one issue with South Africa that people don't think of, is there are strict capital controls on wealth in the country. So even if you're a wealthy person there who could leave for America and be set for life here, or at least have a good start here, you're unable to do it because you can't get money out of the country. It's really hard to transport South African currency and move it into US dollars or whatever and get it out of the country. Whereas you can buy Bitcoin. It'd be hard to smuggle Krugerrands out of the country, but you can memorize 12 words and just dip and be fine.
Yeah, you buy your Bitcoin and then you leave, and then you bring it back. Oh yeah, I got my Bitcoin. There's nothing you can do about it. That's exactly right. It gets around.
Right.
I think currency controls. Yeah, it's funny. If you know the story about Charlie Chaplin's wife, apparently went down and got all his money and sewed all this money into like a fur coat, and then took it out of the country. It was.
I have a grandfather, or it would be a couple greats now, but he hated Roosevelt's no gold order. So like the day it was supposed to occur, he went to the bank and turned all his cash into gold eagles, and they're still sitting in a bank vault. So Yeah,
Wow.
just people hated that, I think. But now with these cryptocurrencies, you might not want to hold them forever, but if you need to move money, you can do it easily and quickly and get around a lot of stuff.
Yeah, you can get around some things. Yeah. Well, it's been good having you on here. You have anything else that you want to say before we go?
That's all for me.
What was your
Thanks,
favorite
everyone.
part of this?
I enjoyed talking about how Rhodesia fell and kind of what Western countries did that turned it into that. A lot of people shy away from that because it's uncomfortable since America was involved, but
Yeah.
I think it's important to talk about.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And, so where can we find you? The American Tribune.news. Where else?
Yeah, so that's where I write long form pieces on, and then I'm on Twitter at Will_Tanner_1, and I post a couple threads there a day.
Uh, so anyway, please buy my novel Escape from the Village. Check out my Substack. Go buymeacoffee.com. Check out my novel Escape from the Village. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I think I mentioned my Substack. Yeah. So thank you, Will Tanner. I'm Chris Baker. We're out.